Meeting is being recorded.
Okay, this is video number 10, and my goal today in this video is to finish our payout policy chapter. So the other day we finished video number 9 by looking at the specific dividend history of Caterpillar, and we in particular looked at the way the stock price responds to a dividend payment, and actually more precisely we looked at how one goes about creating an adjusted stock price series when dividends are paid so that one can compute the return on investing in Caterpillar from one day to the next without having to worry about whether or not a dividend was paid. So we went through the numerical example, and today I want to give you two things. First, the algebraic background behind what we did in that example. And two, I want to also tell you how I would turn those kinds of calculations into an exam question. Okay, so let us do this by going to my web page over here. So let's go to my notes first of all, and let's go down to the dividend section of my notes right here. It's called dividend math. So there we go. So the algebra that you see here, and we're not going to go through it line by line because you can read it for yourself, is exactly what we did with that Caterpillar data that we downloaded from Yahoo Finance in the previous um, video. So this is a demonstration that in fact the adjusted price series does give the proper rate of return on investing in Caterpillar, whether or not a dividend was paid. So I do want to encourage you to look at that algebra. It's not very complicated. It is tedious, no doubt, but it's not complicated. So take a moment to do this. And so that's step number one. Understand the algebra behind what we did. And step number two, like I said, is I want to show you what an exam question based on this algebra would look like. And for that, for the first time, we're going to look at my practice questions for the final. In our very final meeting in this class, we will talk about those practice questions together. It will be a review session that we can all do together, and I will of course give you answers. But for today, I just want to look at one specific such question, which is question number 10 on the practice set. By the way, before I talk about this, question number 11, you will see is a pecking order question. So this will answer the question of how would I turn the pecking order work that we did the other day into an exam question. You can look at it here. It's question 11, and we will talk about question 11 during our review. But the one that pertains to dividend algebra is question number 10. So you see, this is what I would do on an exam. I would give you a very small portion of a corporation's stock price history. And just like we did for Caterpillar, here I would give you the closing price, the actual closing price, the unadjusted closing price, and I would give you the adjusted closing price. And then what I'm going to ask you is questions along the lines shown here. First of all, question number one, when did the stock go ex-dividend? When you remember when we played with Caterpillar, I went down, 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 down until I found the first place where the raw series and the adjusted series differ. And we said this happens on the day at the closing of the day before the ex-dividend day. So the answer to this first question here is the ex-dividend day is December 10th. Why? Because the day before, at the close of the day before, this is the first time I see a gap between the raw series and the adjusted series. So again, the answer to the first question simply is 1210. Then the second question is, what is the value of the dividend? Just like we discussed in video 9, the value of the dividend is going to be the gap, the size of the gap between the raw series and the adjusted series on the day before the ex-dividend day. So here the size of the dividend, simply put, is $5, 109 minus 104. And then the question that I ask you next is, what is the missing value? In other words, how do I compute the adjusted closing price the day before the ex-dividend day? And what we said the other day is the way to do this is the ratio between this number and this number has to be equal to the ratio between this number and that number. In other words, the adjustment that I make the day before the dividend day, the size of the discount, I want to apply the same discount to the entire series prior to the day before the ex-dividend day. So this is a bit of a mouthful, so let us compute exactly what that question mark is. And for that, I just need a plain Excel file, and I'm just going to enter the data that I have in the question, which is on the first day, there is no gap, 110. 110. On the second day, there is a gap, and in fact, the size of that gap is $5. So this is the answer to the question of um, what was the value of the dividend. And then on the day before the ex-dividend day, I know that this is 108, but I don't know what that number is. How do I compute that number? I look at the discount on the day before the ex-dividend day, and that discount is around 5%. And by the way, the other day, I don't remember, we may have looked at the other way of doing this, which is look at the ratio of raw to adjusted, and that's fine. We can use either number. Those two ratios are going to have to be the same. So for instance, if I want to compute the question mark here, uh, I want the ratio of this to that to be 95%. So I'm going to take this number and I'm going to multiply by 95%. And the answer here is my question mark is $100 and about 5 cents. And by the way, just to confirm that if I go the other way, I would get the same answer. The ratio between raw and adjusted is, of course, equals to 1 plus 5%. Okay, so that's it. So this is basically the way I'm going to ask you questions about dividend series on the exam. If I do ask you such questions, it will be, I will give you data like this, which is a small portion of the cat data that we look at that we looked at the other day, and I would ask you those styles of questions. Okay, so that is it in terms of what I want to say about adjusted price series for dividend payments. And now we can go back to my slides and we can go in particular to this key result, which is basically the still 50 years later, 60 years later, the biggest results we have about payout policy, which is once again a result that we owe to Modigliani and Miller. And that result, simply put, says that if we were in perfect markets, so you remember what perfect markets mean: no transaction costs, no frictions of any sorts, and in particular, no taxes whatsoever. If we were in perfect markets, payout policy would be completely irrelevant. In other words, shareholders are in exactly the same position whether or not you pay a dividend to them. As a matter of fact, it does not matter how you finance the dividend, whether you finance it with cash or you finance it by issuing fresh equity to pay the old shareholders the dividend that you want to pay. It does not matter. The financial position of shareholders is not going to be affected. Even better, um, even if you choose to distribute not by paying a dividend, but by doing a stock buyback, again, the financial position of shareholders is going to be unaffected. So we're going to prove this now by example. It's going to be, I think, a numerical example, like always, is going to make this much more clear. But the intuition for this is very simple. Anything that belongs to a corporation already belongs to the shareholder. So whether or not you formally return those assets or that cash, say, to the shareholders does not matter because it is theirs. And since it is theirs, the value of the market value of what the corporation owns that is not claimed by debt holders is going to be the value of the financial position of shareholders. So giving money back or not giving money back in a world where I can do this for free, there's no transaction costs associated with making payments, and there are no tax implications of distributions, is completely irrelevant. You are taking from one pocket to put it in the other pocket, and both pockets belong to shareholders anyway, so it cannot matter. So that's the intuition. And as usual, just like with Modigliani and Miller 1958, what we're going to learn from this is not so much that payout policy does not matter. What we're going to learn from this is if it does matters, it is because markets are imperfect. And in particular, and for payout policy, that is 99% of the story, payout policies are going to have tax implications. And those tax implications are going to be such that there's going to be advantages and disadvantages to different payout policies. The other type of friction that is going to be important, as we've discussed, is asymmetric information. It may be that having the discipline to return money frequently and predictably to shareholders is good because it keeps managers better behaved and the like. But this is exactly how we're going to use this result. In the end, we're going to say, if it were not for those frictions, dividend policy, payout policy in general would not matter. So it does matter. If it does matter, it is because of those frictions. Okay, so let's prove by example Modigliani and Miller's payout policy irrelevant result. So let's open up some Excel, and it is already nice and big and ready to go. So we are going to look at a specific corporation, and that corporation is going to have some operating assets, and the market value of those operating assets is going to be $450 million if you want to speak that way, but I'm just going to refer to it as 450 for now. And it's going to have some cash in addition to those operating assets. So this is going to be excess cash, and that cash is to be worth 50, and that's it. So the market value of the corporation's assets is going to be 500, 450 of which is operating assets, and the rest is excess cash. So that means that the market value of the corporation's assets is, as I said, equal to 450 plus 50. So far, so good. And then the corporation is going to have some debt. Really, it does not matter, as we will see, whether or not you have debt. Dividend irrelevance is not going to matter. Um, and the market value of that debt is going to be 100. And then we're going to say that this is a corporation that has exactly 100 shares outstanding. So the number of shares is going to be 100. So just to, by way of warm up, so the value of each, can I type or not, of each share before any distribution. So this is if we do not distribute anything, which of course we can do. So what is the value of each share? Well, if the market value of my assets is 500 and I owe 100 in debt, the market value of my equity is going to be 400. And if I divide that by 100, I'm going to conclude that the market value of shares before any distribution is made by the corporation is exactly $4. Okay, so far, so good. Now let's distribute. Let's assume that this corporation wants to distribute, and specifically, it's going to give a dividend per share of 30 cents. Okay, so we're going to distribute 30 cents per share, and of course there are 100 shares, so that's something that is going to cost 30 or $30 million to this corporation. Okay, so now the question is, how am I going to finance this dividend? So that's one question, and second is, does it matter? And of course, Modigliani and Miller are going to say that it doesn't matter whether or not you distribute, and even if you choose to distribute, it does not matter how you find a way to finance this dividend. So let's assume, let's take case number one, and let's assume that I'm going to pay for this dividend with cash. So, I have 50 million in cash. I need to find 30 million. So I'm just going to pay for this in cash. So now the value of the share after dividend, so all my 100 shareholders, the value of the share after the dividend is going to be equal to, I had 500 in assets. I still owe this much in debt, but now what am I going to do? I'm going to distribute some dividends. So that means that I'm going to lose part of my cash. How much? Well, there's 100 shares, and I'm going to pay a dividend per share of 30 cents. And by the way, while I'm here, let me be disciplined and put some F4s on all that stuff. Not that it's going to be strictly necessary here, but as we know, it's a good habit. Okay, so this is the market value of my assets after I pay the dividends. Of course, the market value of my asset has gone down. Why? Because I've used up some of my cash. The cash was inside the corporation before. Now I'm going to return it to shareholders. And so that's it. Oop, of course, minus B5 times the size of the dividend. Okay, very good. And I'm going to divide that by the number of shares, and the number of shares has not changed. It is 100, F4. And the result is that my share now is worth $3.7. But of course, I have cash in my cash account has increased, and it has increased by how much? It has increased by 30 cents. The corporation just gave me 30 cents. And now if I sum this up, the total, my financial position is 3.7. That's the market value of the share I own. My cash position has increased by 30 cents. And so the value of my cash position associated with owning a stock in this corporation has not changed. This 4 that we see here is this 4 that we see here. And so even though the algebra felt like a bit long, addition, subtraction, and division, the intuition for this is completely clear. The money was mine anyway. Before it was inside the corporation, now it is in my cash account, but what difference does it make? We are in perfect market. Whether it's yours or mine, we can pass it along. I mean, whether it's inside the corporation or outside the corporation, we can keep passing it along without any transaction costs. It makes no difference. So what we've proved here is that deciding to issue a dividend and paying for it with cash makes no difference whatsoever to shareholders. Their financial situation has not changed. So, but let's try something else. Let's see, instead of depleting my cash, I'm going to pay for this this dividend with a stock issue. So what am I going to do? I'm just going to issue more stocks, and I'm going to go out and sell it in the market, and I'm going to issue just enough that it's going to pay 30 cents to each of the old shareholders. Okay, so the beauty of doing this is now I'm not using up my cash. I'm actually just selling pieces of papers in the market, and I'm going to pay for the dividend in this fashion. So perhaps that's a good deal. Perhaps that is leaving my old shareholders in a better place. Again, you can imagine that it is not going to do that, and it's not going to do that because the market value of the corporation has not changed. That, and if I go out and I issue shares, it's going to increase the number of shares, it's going to dilute the value of each share, and it's exactly going to dilute the value of each share in such a way that by exactly 30 cents. But I just got a check for 30 cents, so my financial position has not changed. So let's verify that that's the case. So I'm going to calculate the number of new stocks needed. Okay, now that takes a moment. So the question is, I need to basically raise how much in new equity? So I have 100 shares and I need to pay 30 cents per share. So I need to find $30. So how am I going to do this? So for that, we're going to go once again to my notes. And let's go here. My notes are here. Make it bigger. Boom, boom, boom. Let's go down. Okay, there we go. Dividends financed by stock issue. There's a typo here. My apologies. I will fix it hopefully by the time you watch this video. Okay, good. So let's look at this algebra. So this algebra is, again, given that I need to pay 30 cents to each of my old shareholders, how many new stocks do I need to issue? Okay, so the unknown in this question is X, which is how many new shares do I need to sell in order to finance my dividend payment. So here on the right hand side of this equation, so let's first have some notation. The market value of the corporation, so that's our 500, that's MV. And shares are currently outstanding in the context of our numerical example, that's 100. The debt has market value D. In the context of our example, it's also 100, and the corporation wishes to give a dividend of size D, that's 30 cents to existing shareholders. So this is here 100 times 30 cents. That's what I have to finance. And I'm going to finance it by selling X shares, and then the market value of those X shares is going to be this guy here. But before we get into this part of the calculation, what this is saying is X times what I can sell those shares for has to be equal to $30. Okay, so what can I sell my new shares for? Well, this up here is the good old market value of assets, NV minus D, which is 400 in our case. This here is the number of shares after I issue my new shares. So this is N, my old shares, plus X, my new shares. So this is the value of shares are going to go down. Why? Because now there is dilution. Yes, I get to sell new shares in the market, but there are more shares out there and people, so that means that the value of each share is going to go down, which is again something we call dilution. Okay, so you do the math. The math has, it's not particularly interesting, but this is the formula that we're going to want to use, and this is going to give us exactly the number of shares that we need to sell to get the $30 that we need to pay that dividend to our old shareholders. So let me try to do to put it on both screens here so I can have them side by side. That's going to be nice. Yes, very good. So number of new stocks needed. I'm going to put a little X here so you know what I'm computing. So the number of new stocks needed is going to be equal to, I'm just going to follow my formula. So it says N square, N is the number of old shares, so squared, times the size of the dividend. And again, I'm not being good about my F force. Let me be better about my X force. So that's the numerator of this expression. And then I'm going to enter the denominator, which is market value, F4, minus the debt, F4, minus N. Um, That is good. F4 times the dividend per share, F4. Okay, that I'm just checking that I did not make an obvious mistake here, and I'm going to push enter, and what it says is I need to sell 8.11 new shares or so. So we will, soon enough, we will be able to check whether or not that is correct. Whether that calculation worked, but it should if we did our algebra over here correctly. So let's go here. So let's calculate now the value of old shares. So what I'm doing here is, once again, I'm looking at the financial position of my old shareholders. So I'll do the easy part first. They are getting, at least supposedly, um, another 30 cents in their cash account. So we know that their financial position has improved by this much. But what about the value of the old share? So the value of the old share, to compute it, it's going to be market value of assets minus the market value of debt. And I'm going to close the parentheses here. So that's the beauty of financing the new debt issue by issuing new stock, right? Because I no longer have to deplete my cash position. So that's good. That helps. But on the other hand, what's going to happen is there's going to be dilution. Namely, my number of share is no longer 100, but instead it is 100 plus 8.11. Okay. And the answer is going to be 3.7. So as you can see, the financial position once again is exactly the same. If I calculate my total financial position after, it is equal to the value of my share, which has gone down because of dilution, but on the other hand, I just got 30 cents from the corporation. And by the way, I said now we can verify, I mean, it's kind of obvious, but we can verify that our 8.11 is exactly correct. How? How much cash is raised if by issuing 8.11? It is 8.11 times the new value, the value of the share after the stock issue. And if I do this, I get exactly the 30 that I need to finance. I need to finance 30 because I have 100 shares and I want to pay old shares and I want to pay each of these old shareholders 30 cents. Okay, so let us recapitulate what we've done so far. The financial position of all shareholders is completely independent of whether or not a dividend per share is paid, and it's also independent of how the dividend is paid, whether you're going to use cash or you're going to use stock. And by the way, we could continue. Maybe we want to sell some of our operating assets to finance the dividend. Why not? In pure and perfect markets, I can do that. I can sell them anytime I want at no cost for market value, and we would arrive at exactly the same answer. It does not matter. It does not matter because already what's inside the corporation is owned by shareholders. Whether I formally write a check to them to reflect the fact that it's theirs is completely irrelevant in perfect markets. So I said that whether or not you pay a dividend in the first place does not matter. We can check this here by changing the dividend per share to 0. Of course, if you change the dividend share to 0, we are left in the original position. But what if I only pay 20 cents in dividend? It does not matter. I just need to issue fewer stocks to pay for it or deplete my cash a little bit less. I mean, it really doesn't matter what number you're going to make here. Okay, good. So since I mean, we have proved just about everything we need to prove, let's just go one step further, which is what if I, instead of returning cash to my shareholder by paying dividend, what if I just buy back some of those stocks? So what I'm saying here is, hey, you're a shareholder, you want money back. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to use some of my cash to retire your stock. So I'm going to turn your $4 into cash, which is another way to pay cash out to you. Does that matter? Is this something that is going to affect the financial position of shareholders? And again, for exactly the same intuition, you can imagine that it simply does not matter here. If we choose to buy back some shares, it's going to leave my shareholders completely unaffected. So let's assume that we do a share buyback, which is exactly equivalent to the cash transfer I'm making to my shareholders under the dividend policy. So what do I mean by this? We're going to buy back the same as what I'm spending on my dividends, which is 100 times dividend per shares of 30 cents. So that's $30. So I'm just going to take $30 from my cash and I'm going to buy back some of those stocks, and those are going to be called what we call treasury stocks. So those pieces of papers are not going to be burnt. They're just going to go into a vault inside the corporation instead of being on the market. So it's as if they're retired from the market. Okay, so the question is, how many shares do I get to buy and put in my treasury if I spend $30? Well, it is what I'm spending divided by the total size of equity, which is the market value of my asset, F4 minus debt, F4. So right here in parentheses, this is the total size of my equity. So if I divide 30 by the total size of my equity, this is telling me the fraction number of shares. I need to multiply this by the total number of shares. So if I'm buying back 10% of the equity, I get 10% of the pieces of paper. This is what I'm saying here. And the answer is I've retired exactly 7.5 shares. 7.5 shares that were in the market before are no longer in the market. So now, after the stock, if I do the stock repurchase way of giving money back to my shareholders, I can calculate the value of the share buyback. So if you are a shareholder and there is a stock buyback, you have a choice. You can sell or you can't sell. If you do sell, you're going to get 30 divided by 7.5. You're obviously going to get $4, which is the market value of those stocks. So you can get $4 that way. By the way, $4 is exactly what you had before, since that was the value of the stock that you held. So you're certainly held indifferent. But what if you don't sell? So if you do not sell, what happens here? If you do not sell, the market value of equity after the stock repurchase is 500 minus the market value of my debt minus the $30 here, which has to come from somewhere. It doesn't matter where it comes from. Maybe it comes from my cash, maybe I have to sell some operating asset, but that's going to deplete my assets. If I, as a corporation, I use $30 that I have somehow, some way to do a buyback, this is $30 that are no longer parts of my assets. And I'm going to divide that, but I'm going to divide that. And by the way, again, I should have some F4s here, certainly. And I'm going to divide that by the number of shares remaining. How many shares are remaining? There were 100 before, F4, and I am buying back 7.5. So this is what is left. And if I push enter, I get exactly the magic number of $4. So let's go through the entire share repurchase. I had $4 before the corporation did anything. If I sold my share to the corporation, I got $4 in cash. So that's certainly the same. If I do not sell my share to the corporation during the buyback and I keep it, my share is still worth $4. So again, it is completely irrelevant. It's completely irrelevant whether or not there is a buyback, whether or not I participate in the buyback. Its irrelevance is complete and perfect. Okay, so this is a proof here, a proof by example, but you can see that this is completely general. We could write a formal, geeky, mathematical proof of this and arrive at exactly the same place. And again, what we have established here is that when markets are perfect, no transaction costs, no taxes, payout policy is completely irrelevant. Whether you pay dividend or not, the size of the dividend, how you finance that dividend, whether you do a share repurchase or not, the size of that share repurchase, whether you choose to sell your stock in the context of a repurchase or keep your stock in the context of a repurchase, your financial position as an incumbent shareholder is completely unaffected, because all that's happened through all those complicated calculations is we've moved money from one of your pockets to the other one, and obviously that cannot affect you. Okay, very good. So this is the key result in payout policy on the theoretical side. And the question then is, what do we do with this? And so what we do with this is, again, we ask ourselves, okay, so we do see treasurers and CFOs worry a lot about their payout policy. So why is that? And the answer is, well, in the world, unlike in the world of Modigliani Miller, there are frictions. Obviously, taxes, for instance, because dividends are taxed, whereas stock repurchases are not taxed. Obviously, if you want to redistribute money, you should, all else equal, try to do a stock repurchase. So the problem is, of course, there are limitations, and there are limitations for two reasons. First, the IRS does not want you to do this for tax avoiding reasons. So there has to be, you have to state at least another reasons. And two, as you heard in the current conversation, I was going to say political conversation, but it's conversation will do. There is also this belief that corporations are using stock repurchases to manipulate the price of equity, and that is obviously price manipulation by corporations is considered to be a bad thing, and therefore there is a push for regulating stock repurchases. And this is especially important because of the recent tax reform, whose intent presumably, ostensibly, was to encourage firms to invest more, but people are upset because they say, well, they're not investing more. What they're doing is they're doing more and more stock repurchases. So all that money is going back to shareholders. And some people say that is bad. And I do not want to participate in this very interesting conversation, but that is something for society to decide. That is not a financial um, conversation. The point is there is a call for instance, taxing stock repurchases. Now, given what we just did, the very simple example that we did, the idea of taxing stocks repurchases is complicated. And it's complicated, for instance, when there is a stock repurchase, I do not necessarily have to participate in it. So you have two types of shareholders, those that sold to the corporation and those that do not. So the, on given the taxing idea, should we tax those two shareholders the same? Should we exempt the people who choose to hold on to their stock in the middle of a stock repurchase and only tax them on their capital gains? Those are very complicated um, conversations. Okay, so, but obviously taxes do break the equivalence result of Modigliani and Miller. For sure, and the most obvious part is stock repurchases now become better, all else equal, for corporations and their shareholders than dividends. There is no question about that. And I repeat, just going back to the first slide, the other reasons why payout policy matters in a world with frictions. When you have asymmetric information, when managers have superior information about their corporation, payout policy largely is a way to convey to the world a message about the state of the corporation. When we looked at Caterpillar in the previous video, we saw that last week they insisted on making exactly the same dividend payment as they have for the past 3 quarters, in spite of the fact that the world has changed, in spite of the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty, which would lead that corporation to say, you know what, perhaps we should be more careful, perhaps we should keep that cash around. But they did, nevertheless, pay a dividend. Why? Because they felt, I mean, this is conjecture, but I feel pretty good about that conjecture. They wanted to tell the world that they're going to be all right, that CAT is fine, that we are able to continue paying dividends the way we have, because this shock is not going to destroy us or hurt our bottom line as much as perhaps the market may think it will. So that's point number one. And point number two is, in a world of asymmetric information, again, with managers having superior information, having all that cash around is creating temptations, as I said, for managers. And the fact returning that cash on a regular basis is a way to discipline managers. So again, this is the Jensen free cash flow view of the world. And that view is very simple, that there is something good about having payment obligations in the case of debt and virtual obligations in the case of sticky dividends. If Cat has said to the world, you know what, we are going to pay dividends and our dividends are only going to go up, they're going to be sticky, come hell or high water, we're going to pay those dividends. One of the virtues is this is a management team that's telling us, we're not going to goof around with your money. That money is yours, and our intent therefore is to return it to you on a regular and predictable basis. Okay, that is all I'm going to say in this chapter about payout policy, and that will only leave one video which will be dedicated to the value of flexibility in capital budgeting, but that will be for next time, and for today I am done.